Something happens the moment the odds are announced. The crowd shifts. Not toward the favorite, toward the other one. The one with less. Less money, less history, less chance. And you feel it too. This strange gravitational pull in your chest. This almost involuntary allegiance to someone you have never met. Someone who might fail spectacularly in front of millions of people. You want them to win. You need them to win. The question is why? And the more honestly you examine that question, the less flattering the answer becomes. Consider what rooting for the underdog actually involves. You are emotionally investing in a probable loss. You are choosing to attach your hope to the thing statistically most likely to disappoint you. This is not rational. Humans are pattern recognition machines, evolved across millennia to identify strength and align with it. Survival demanded it for most of our history. And yet here we are, worldwide, across cultures, across centuries, pulling for the weaker side. Joseph Vandello, at the University of South Florida, documented this in 2017, demonstrating that the preference is not merely American sentimentality. It appears cross-culturally. It is something older and stranger than fairness or sportsmanship. What makes it stranger still is that we do it even when we know nothing about the underdog. In controlled studies, participants consistently favored competitors, labeled simply as unlikely to win. The label alone was sufficient. No personality, no backstory, no admirable struggle on display. Just the statistical disadvantage. Something in us responds to that number, that percentage, that implied weakness, with something close to love. The psychological foundation of this sits in social comparison theory, developed by Leon Festinger in 1954. Festinger's core insight was deceptively simple. Humans perpetually evaluate themselves by comparing themselves to others, and these comparisons shape nearly everything about how we feel and who we choose to align with. When we watch an underdog, we are not comparing ourselves to the favorite. The favorite exists in a register too remote from our own experience to serve as a useful mirror. We compare ourselves to the underdog, and we find resemblance there. This is the mechanism psychologists call identification. When we watch an underdog, we are not really watching them. We are watching a version of ourselves, or more precisely, a version of how we privately experience ourselves. Most people, most of the time, carry a quiet internal conviction that they have been underestimated, that the obstacles they face are disproportionate to what they deserve, that the game, in some fundamental sense, is not entirely level. The underdog externalizes that feeling. They make the private grievance public, visible, and expressible, without requiring the self-exposure that would come from admitting it directly. When researchers studied political underdogs, they found something that should unsettle anyone who considers their choices to be primarily rational. Voters consistently reported feeling more positive emotional effect toward candidates positioned as the less powerful party, even when controlling for policy preference. The underdog framing changed the emotional character of the choice. People were not simply evaluating platforms. They were managing psychological needs through the candidate they chose to believe in. Policy preference was often rationalized after the fact. The emotional allegiance came first, and it came from somewhere more personal than ideology. There are several distinct psychological processes operating here simultaneously, and they do not all point in the same direction. The first is what researchers call the effort heuristic. In a series of experiments, Neeru Paharia at Georgetown University found that people assign greater moral worth to outcomes achieved through difficulty. The underdog has to work harder, and we are wired to equate effort with virtue. This is not evidence of generosity. It is evidence of a bias. We are not rewarding effort because effort inherently deserves reward. We are using effort as a proxy for goodness because the arithmetic of effort is easier to track than the genuine complexity of character. The person who tries harder must be worth more. It is a shortcut. And shortcuts of this kind are how we get things badly wrong. The second process runs through what John Jost at NYU calls system justification theory. This is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. System justification describes our tendency to defend and rationalize existing social hierarchies, even when those hierarchies work against our own interests. We want to believe that the powerful are powerful for good reasons. It makes the world feel ordered, comprehensible, predictable. But the underdog narrative offers us a release valve. We can momentarily indulge the fantasy that the hierarchy can be disrupted, that the structure is not permanent, without actually having to challenge it ourselves. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to change anything. You just have to feel something on a Sunday afternoon. And that feeling carries the emotional signature of solidarity without the cost of action. The underdog loses, and you return to your ordinary life. The underdog wins, and you feel briefly, vicariously, powerful. Either way, the hierarchy remains intact. Either way, you are not required to examine your own position in it too carefully. There is a third layer, rooted in terror management theory, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky in the 1980s. The central claim is that much of human behavior is unconsciously organized around managing awareness of our own mortality. When death is made conceptually salient, when it is brought close, people's emotional and political allegiances shift in measurable ways. Studies have shown that mortality salience increases identification with underdogs, particularly those who represent a struggle against overwhelming force. Because the underdog fight mirrors something existential that most of us feel but rarely say. The smallness of a single life against the scale of everything larger than it. None of this is cynical in its origin. The impulse is genuine. But genuine impulses can be exploited. And the underdog narrative has become one of the most effective manipulation technologies in modern life. Political campaigns understand this with precision. A candidate worth hundreds of millions of dollars can position themselves as fighting against the establishment. And the emotional centers of the brain respond in nearly the same way they respond to an actual underdog. The framing overrides the facts. Branding consultants have a name for this: the underdog brand effect. Small batch whiskey, challenger phone companies, neighborhood coffee shops, all structuring their identity around the implied threat of the larger player. David and Goliath is not merely a story. It is a repeatable consumer trigger, and it has been studied, mapped, and sold back to us in formats that have nothing to do with who actually holds power. What is particularly strange about this is what researcher Scott Allison at the University of Richmond has called the hero worship paradox. We celebrate the underdog who overcomes, but once they overcome, once they become the dominant force, we withdraw our affection almost immediately. The scrappy team that everyone loved becomes the dynasty everyone resents. The startup that disrupted the industry becomes the next monopoly. We don't transfer our loyalty. We just find a new underdog. It is the striving that moves us, not the arrival. This tells us something important. What we are attached to is not the person, not even the cause. We are attached to a particular emotional state, the sensation of hope against the odds, the pleasure of being on the side that is morally right, but materially disadvantaged. The underdog is the vehicle for producing that state. Once they stop producing it, we move on without ceremony. Consider what this looks like in ordinary life. In relationships, workplaces, friendships, not stadiums, not elections. You have almost certainly encountered this dynamic without naming it. The person who positions themselves as perpetually overwhelmed, perpetually working against forces beyond their control, perpetually under-resourced. And you find yourself giving more patience, more forgiveness, more energy than you would give to someone presenting themselves as capable and stable. The underdog framing in personal relationships functions as a solicitation of emotional investment, and we respond to it with nearly the same reliability as we respond to it in sport. This can be entirely benign. People do suffer. People do face genuine disadvantage. But the mechanism can be weaponized, consciously or not. The person who always frames themselves as the underdog in any conflict, with employers, with family, with strangers, is doing something specific with that framing. They are pre-activating your sympathy before the facts of the situation have been examined. By the time you are asking yourself whether the sympathy is warranted, you have often already committed to it. In workplaces, This manifests in dynamics that are genuinely difficult to navigate. The colleague who is always struggling more than anyone else, always facing obstacles that others don't, always positioned as the one doing the hardest thing against the most opposition. They attract advocacy from people who would otherwise apply more critical scrutiny. Leaders who understand this, even intuitively, can construct entire careers around the perception of being under-resourced and overburdened. It does not require lying. It requires only careful curation of what you choose to make visible. Here's what this means for you specifically. And this is the part that requires some honesty. You are not a passive observer of underdog dynamics. You participate in them, almost certainly on multiple sides. There are contexts in which you are the person presenting yourself as the underdog, choosing which struggles to make visible, shaping the narrative of your own difficulty in ways that solicit support. This is not a character flaw. It is a social behavior so normalized, it is functionally invisible, but it is worth knowing that you do it. There are also contexts in which your sympathy for the underdog has been operating as a bypass, allowing you to feel morally engaged while avoiding the harder question of whether your loyalty is actually warranted. The question is not whether to feel for the struggling. The question is whether you are feeling for them or feeling through them. Whether your investment in their outcome is genuinely about them, or whether it is about something you need to experience. Research by Vandello and colleagues found that when people are asked to predict underdog outcomes, they consistently and significantly overestimate the probability of an upset. This is not ignorance. It is motivated cognition. The need for the underdog to be possible overrides the honest assessment of the odds. We want to believe that effort defeats structure, that heart defeats resources, that the individual can face the institution and occasionally prevail. But if that is true, then perhaps something similar is possible in our own lives. The underdog's victory is borrowed evidence that the world is not as fixed as it usually feels. The psychology here is not unflattering because it reveals selfishness. It is unflattering because it reveals how thoroughly our emotional lives are organized around needs we rarely examine. The preference for the underdog is, at its core, a preference for a particular story about how the world should work, one in which disadvantage is not permanent, in which effort occasionally matters more than accumulated advantage, in which the powerful can be made to feel, for a moment, what it is to be small. That is not a corrupt preference. It might be one of the more defensible ones we have. But the preference operates largely outside conscious awareness, which means it can be activated by symbols and framings rather than by reality. You can be made to feel like you are backing the underdog when you are, in fact, backing the established power, simply because that power has learned to wear the narrative correctly. What the research ultimately points toward is a fundamental tension in how we construct meaning. We want to believe that the structure of the world is just, and we want to believe that the structure of the world can be overcome. These desires are in direct contradiction. And the underdog narrative is the cultural technology we have developed to hold both of them simultaneously, for the duration of a game, a campaign, a story. It lets us feel the order and the rebellion at once, without requiring us to choose between them. That is not nothing. Stories that successfully manage contradictions have always been the ones that endure. David and Goliath is not present in nearly every human culture because it is literally true. It is there because it contains something we cannot stop needing to feel. The question is only whether you want to feel it with some awareness of the mechanism behind it, with some understanding of what the feeling is for and what it is doing to your judgment, or whether you would prefer to let the mechanism run without your knowledge. The latter is more comfortable. The former is considerably more interesting.